What is up, you guys? I hope you're doing well. Welcome back to my channel. I'm Tony Fuentes, and I hope you're having a very nice Christmas and end to the year. Today, we're returning to the AI series, and the style that we're going to break down today is NorthBorders. Now, this creator shoots dramatic car photography and urban photography, particularly at nighttime, and it was suggested by some of you guys, several of you guys actually, in the comment section of previous videos. So if you have any other profiles that you want me to break down, put them down below and I'll slowly check them out. So today we're going to first of all jump into Instagram and check out some examples of his color grading to know what we're going to do when we jump into Lightroom, edit a photo and create a preset or presets out of it. So let's jump into it. So here we have Mike's profile on Instagram, otherwise known as NorthBorders. If you want to go and follow him, more than 420,000 subscribers or followers. And down here you can find the link to his website where he also has his preset shop. So if you're only interested in achieving his color grading, the best way you can do it is just go and buy his presets directly and achieve his genuine look. Remember that my tutorials, well, the only purpose of them is to learn how to color grade and practice, and we just use the profiles of these famous creators as an example to create an exercise. Now, if you take a broad look at his feed, you can notice that it has some punchy images with low exposure and harsh contrast. Most of it is due to the fact that it's shot at nighttime, but also he's adding this contrast in the color grading department in post-edition. You can see how the shadows, you can basically raise them up if you're shooting raw photography. In this case, he brings them down. He's not afraid to do that and lose some information in order to achieve more of a dramatic and punchy looking image. Now, when someone mentions NorthBorders to me, I immediately think of cars, but in particular, I think of blue or aqua tones. And we can see it. This is the style that it's most relevant in his feed, where we see these punchy images with high contrast, and then we see those blues added into the entire image. And sometimes it's a bit more saturated, sometimes it's a bit more subtle, and other times he takes them towards the greener tones. But this is in essence the style that he's best known for, and this is the style that we're going to try to replicate today. So yes, he does have other variants for maybe sunset photography or daylight photography, but in general terms, this is the style that is most representative of his feed. Now, in order to create those variants, the green variants or the blue variants, first of all, we need to nail down the exposure and contrast and the saturation on his general style. Now, these type of images in these settings in overcast days, we can see his style without that green tint or that blue tint added. And in essence, this is what I would consider to be his base style, because he has that contrast, that loss of information in the shadows, and we can pay attention to what he does in the saturation department. We can see how basically all the cool tones, with the exception of a bit of the blues, are completely gone. Greens are gone, purples are gone, magentas are gone, and even the reds, and we're just retaining a bit of the oranges and yellows in the skyscrapers. Now, I have to be honest with you guys, this style, in fact, this same image is very similar to the color grading of Alan Palander and Garrett King. I'm going to post two comparison images right here, and you can see that there's little to no difference. I would consider that NorthBorders is in the middle of Garrett King and Alan Palander, but it's a very similar color grading. Then from this base preset, we can create the variants. So we can start off by looking at what he does over here. And it's basically the same contrast, same saturation, but now what he does is add some green tones in color grading. And it's added to the entirety of the image, creating this very dramatic image. Now, a little detail is that the reds and the oranges in the lights are very vibrant, and that's because he messes around in camera calibration. That's just a bonus, guys, to this preset. Then those greens, in other scenarios, he changed them more towards teal colors or aqua tones over here. And then in other cases, most of the cases, he changes them to this very deep blue. Now, as you can see, this image is a bit more contrasty and punchy compared to the previous ones, and that's because he's adding some clarity. Now, clarity, what it does is just add more contrast in the midtones. Therefore, you can see how the rims or the wheels of the car and the reflections on the paint are really shining and very vibrant, and that's because clarity is being added into this image, and as a consequence, the entire image is a bit more punchy. Now, in other cases, he does the opposite. He reduces the clarity and raises the blacks, so you have a softer image, more like a film. So as you can see, it's a very versatile way of coloring to create a base preset and then alter it depending on the emotions that you want to evoke with each image. Okay, creators, here in Lightroom have this little collection of urban and street photography. None of these photos are car photography because, well, I haven't dived into that world just yet. So you have to pretend that we're editing cars. Now, right here, just a little tip before we jump into editing is that Collections are a really important basis of my color grading process. Collections are basically just folders within Lightroom Classic where you can group photos from different devices. So for example, I have these images that are from this SSD and some others from Japan that are from this other one. And you can basically just use these collections to group images. Maybe you're a model photographer and you have different shoots from the same model. You can group them all into a single folder within Lightroom so you can edit them and access them quickly. Or right here that have several photos of nighttime photography, I can add them into a specific collection. So yeah, that's just a little tip to make your editing process a bit easier. So I'm just going to select this image, I guess, and with D on your keyboard, you're going to move to the Develop tab. So starting out, we're going to create the base preset. Now the base preset is just the overcast type preset that he uses in the helicopter shot that we saw, comparing him to Alan Palander or Garrett King, and it has a bit more contrast and a lot of desaturated tones with the exception of the warm tones. So let's start off with this one. Now, first of all, we want to nail down the exposure and contrast, and for that, we're going to use the basic corrections plus the tone curve. Think of them as two different layers to achieving a specific goal. Right here, first of all, exposure and contrast, these two sliders, I like to omit them and not use them because these are the values that I'm going to use to compensate maybe if the shot was underexposed or overexposed in field. We're going to use these two general sliders, and also if the white balancing is wrong, we're going to use the temperature and tint. So we're going to start off with the highlights, shadows, whites and blacks. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to bring back a bit of the highlights. We don't want to go towards the positives, otherwise we attain more brightness in the higher parts of the exposure, and this will create a lot of loss of information. Instead, I'm going to go towards the negatives ever so slightly, not too much, around the -14, just to preserve a bit more of the highlights. Now, talk about bright parts. Whites control the brightest parts on our image and highlights control more towards the midtone. So the brightest parts on our image will be controlled by the whites, and I am going to pull them down just a bit as well, around the -30. Now, this is nighttime photography, so we are going to be dealing with bright lights, whether it be from the street lights or from announcements in the background or spectacular signs. So we are interested in reducing a bit of the overexposure in those elements because we're mostly not going to be exposing towards the giant Coca-Cola sign in the background. Instead, we're going to be exposing towards the subject, and that part is going to be completely blown out. So that's why I'm bringing back the highlights and also the whites. Now, opposite to that, the shadows, we could be tempted to bring them up and use all the capacity and the dynamic range of raw photography, and as you can see, a lot more information and detail appears, but this isn't what we want. NorthBorders actually reduces the amount of information in the shadows. So I'm just going to reset the shadows so we have a contrasty image, and the blacks will control the dark parts on our image. I'm going to bring them towards the negatives as well, not too much, maybe around the -17. It's just going to be enough just to attain a bit more contrast and loss of information there. Okay, next, the tone curve. Now, the tone curve is a very powerful tool that allows us to control the exposure and contrast, yes, but also with the Y RGB channels, we can use it to create some different looks in the color grading department. Now, I'm not going to go into detail into those tools, but I already made a tutorial about the tone curve. It's going to be appearing up here. Also, any tool that we use today, just look at the banner that's going to be appearing up here with the respective video about that tool. We're not going to go too into detail into any of the tools today. The purpose of this tutorial is to create the NorthBorders color grading. Okay, so I'm going to create a point in the shadows and a point in the highlights. Now, first of all, the shadows, I'm just going to bring it down below the diagonal, just achieve a lot more sharpness and contrast in the shadows. And this is where the point is going to be. It's going to be an input value of 45 and the output of 35. Now, these are basically just the coordinates of this point over here. So if you're not too sure where to place it, you can always just copy the settings that I'm pasting and that I'm putting in. Then the highlights, I'm just going to drag them down again below the diagonal to preserve the bright parts of the image with the values of 177 and 165. Whites, I'm just going to leave them like that. And then this point over here will control the blacks. Now, this will depend on your personal choice, guys. We saw in some examples where there were pure blacks in the image, like in the Supra, very punchy and contrasty, like we have over here in this image. But in other cases, in the more filmic-like edits, we saw them completely grayed out. So move this point up in the vertical axis. You can notice how the blacks turn into gray if you compare it to the Instagram to the Lightroom interface over here, and this is completely grayed out. So right here will depend on what you're looking for by creating this preset. In my case, I'm just going to leave it maybe in the middle, maybe not too high, not too low, maybe a plus 12%, just to fade them out just a bit, ever so slightly, but they're still considered as blacks. So compared to the original, we just have a punchier looking image with a bit more contrast, faded out blacks, and a bit more information in the bright parts of the image. Nothing too extravagant. Now, one thing that is very extravagant is the clarity tool. And we did mention this in the example image of the Supra, that he uses a lot of clarity in car photography in particular. So now that my dog stopped barking, the clarity, I'm just going to leave it at 0, but you guys can include it in the preset. So for example, right here, pay attention to the cars, the reflections, the lights, everything. If I pull up the clarity towards the positives, immediately everything turns to be a bit more dramatic, a bit more punchy, because we're adding contrast in the midtones. That's what clarity does essentially. So I wouldn't save this preset like this. I would consider a value maybe around the plus 20, 25% maximum. This is an error that I used to do way back when I was starting out, just pull up the clarity towards the plus 100. But in this case, you guys can play around. I'm going to leave it at 0 for this tutorial. Okay, that's for the exposure and contrast of the space preset or overcast preset. Let's move down to the colors. Now in colors, first of all, we just want to desaturate a lot of the tones, with the exception of the oranges and the reds. These are the two colors that are best well preserved in his style. So magentas and purples, we can basically nullify them completely. We don't see them in his feed at all. Then blues, we are just going to bring them down maybe around the minus 50, and we're going to do the same with the other values as well. Greens and as well yellows will control a lot of the greens as well, normally in raw photography. So again, to the minus 50s. And right here we have an image where it's basically very dimmed down and desaturated, minus the warm tones that are taking a lot more relevance. So right here, our base preset is mostly ready, but I would add an optional last step, which is camera calibration. Now, you saw that in some example images, we saw that the reds, the yellows, and the oranges, particularly in stop signs or in the lights of the cars, really glowed a lot more and were basically luminescent, and that's done in camera calibration. Now I say this step to be an optional one because it won't make the greatest change on our edit, and also I know that a lot of you guys edit in your mobile device, and the mobile versions of Lightroom do not have camera calibration. A little parenthesis, if you guys have the subscription on Lightroom Mobile, in the same manner that you have the subscription on mobile, you also have included the desktop and the Lightroom Classic, but maybe some of you guys don't have a computer, so that's why I'm not making this step so important in this edit. So right here we have camera calibration, and we have the red, the green, and the blue primary. These are the RGB. Every single pixel on our digital image, on our screen, on the video that you're watching right now on your phone, is composed by the combination of these three colors. So right here, we're basically altering the color science on our image. But we're not going to alter too much right here. All we want is to brighten up those reds, those oranges, and make them glow just a bit more. Now, first of all, the reds, we want to take them a bit more towards the brick-like colors. So I'm going to go towards the positives, the red primary. Notice how immediately they're taking towards the oranges and yellows. This is way too high, maybe a plus, I don't know, 17 is going to be enough. And then we're going to use the blue primary to brighten them up just a bit more. And this will also affect a bit of the blues, just making them a bit more aqua. Now, you're maybe asking, why is the blue primary affecting the yellows? And that's because, well, first of all, we don't have a yellow slider over here. But if we look at the color wheel over here, we can see that the blues are direct opposite from the yellows. Camera calibration works with color contrast and complementary colors. So by moving the blue slider, we are affecting the blues. We are affecting every other color, but in larger sense, we are affecting the blues and the direct opposite in the color wheel, which is the yellows. So pay attention how I pull up the saturation. Immediately you can notice which colors are affecting on this image, and it's the yellows in particular. They're being affected largely by the saturation slider on the blue primary. The same thing applies with the hue. We're affecting the blues mostly. So right here, I'm just gonna take them a bit more towards the oranges, towards the negatives, around the minus 19, and the saturation, put it up to make them a lot more vibrant, maybe around the plus 20. Nothing too crazy, but enough just to make a little bit of a difference. Just adding a bit more brightness and relevance into the warmer tones. So the base preset or the overcast preset is finished. Let's save it and apply it into a couple of different photos to see if it works or if we need to tweak it. So to save a preset, you need to go to the left panel over here, hit the plus sign, create a preset, and here we want to mark every little box that we edited. So right here, for example, white balance, exposure, and contrast, we didn't use them, so I'm not going to mark them. Neither detail, lens corrections, transform. We are going to mark camera calibration, FX shouldn't be marked, and we're going to hit create. So here I have this image of New York taken from the Rockefeller. I think it's just about after blue hour, so it's too dark. So let's apply the base preset over here. And as you can see, it works fantastic. It reduces a lot of the blues, a lot of the other colors, and makes the warmer tones take a bit more relevance. Now, in this case, I would use the clarity because we don't have a central subject, and the clarity will make this image pop a lot more, something around these lines, and it just looks fantastic. How about over here in this image in Times Square, let's apply the base preset. And there we have it. It just adds a bit more punch into the image, a lot more punchy and contrasty, while reducing a bit of saturation of the surrounding environment. So if we deactivate it, you can see how all the colors in the background are very vivid, including the magentas that we don't want. And then we add them, and it's just a bit more of a neutral looking image, similar to the preset that we created for Alan Palander. Okay, so I think the preset works quite well. Now let's create the variants. Now don't worry, this isn't going to take too long. It's going to be a very simple edit to create the two variants, the blue and then the green one. So once we have an image with the base preset applied, so we don't have to do this all over again, we're going to move down to color grading. And color grading, otherwise known or previously known as split toning, will allow us to add a color into the shadows, into midtones, or into the highlights, and control the saturation and also the luminance. So right here, it's a very simple process. We're just going to create the blue preset and then the green preset. So I won't add a color into the highlights because, well, otherwise it's quite strange when we add a color into the bright parts on our image, into the lights. We did see this in the super image. The lights in the background and also of the car were blue, but it doesn't work quite well in other type of scenarios. So in this case, I'm just going to add the blue into the shadows, and color grading works with the exposure on our image. Well, each of these sliders depends on what Lightroom considers as shadows, what Lightroom considers as midtones, or as highlights. Of course, we can control that balance with the balance tool over here. But right here, you can notice, being nighttime photography, that Lightroom is going to classify most of the image as a shadow. So right here, if I add a blue into the shadows, look how most of the image is being painted. Of course, with the balance tool will help us out to make our edit a bit more precise. As you can see, moving up, we're telling Lightroom that most of the image is in the highlights. Moving it down, we're telling basically Lightroom that all the image is shadow. So you need to use the balance tool if you have strange scenarios where the shadows are being overlapped with the color that you add in the midtones or in the highlights. Anyway, I digress. Back to the tutorial. I'm going to add a color over here. You can play around with the hue, guys. I'm going to go with this one, 213 on the hue. Maybe you want to go a bit more towards the aquas, maybe a bit more towards the magentas. It's your choice. I'm going to go with this one to the lighter blues. And obviously the saturation is way too high, but around the plus 25 is going to be enough. And then I'm going to double down the settings by copying them. Right click, copy settings. I'm going to apply them to the midtones as well. But here the saturation, I'm just going to reduce it just a bit around the plus 15. With Y on our keyboard, we can see the before and after, and we're just adding these blue tones into the shadows and into the midtones. Now I'm going to save it because I know that in some other images it's going to be a bit harsher, and maybe we need to nail back a bit of the saturation. So I'm going to save this preset, again to the left panel, create a preset. I'm going to move to others. So here we have this image of the Shinkansen train in Japan. Let's apply, first of all, let's see the base preset, just adds a bit more punch and contrast, what we were looking for. And then the blue one just adds this blue tint into the entirety of the image. Again, you guys can play around with the saturation if you want a bit more of an emphatic look. I went with subtle settings, so this preset is a bit more useful. And also you can use the amount slider over here, which is available in all Lightroom versions, to add more contrast and also more saturation. Notice how I go towards the positives, the blues become more intensified, but also the contrast, and we have more of a dramatic image. This is quite similar to some of the photos that we saw in the example images. But in general terms, I think we did quite a good job with this preset. Now let's create the green variant, which is going to be a similar process. So once again, base preset applied, we're going to move down to color grading once again. And here we're going to add some green tones. Now, what green? Again, depends on you guys. Maybe you want an emerald like green like this one, a mint like green. Maybe you want a yellowish type of green that we also saw in his feed. It all depends on you guys. You can create like 15 different variants from this base preset. So I'm just going to select, let's say this one, a bit more of a mint like color. The hue is going to be 168. Saturation as well is going to be exactly the same, 25 in the shadows and 15 on the midtone, something around these lines. And then we have this very light mint color into the image. Of course, you guys as well can go with the saturation a bit ham to have a more of an intense type of color. How about in this image? Let's apply first of all base preset, a bit more punchy, blue preset, this blue tone, And then the green preset that works fantastically in these types of street photography. And of course, you guys again can go with the amount to have a more of a dramatic image, or just leave it a bit more subtle. Okay, so in the image of Times Square, this is the base preset. Then we have the blue preset, which has this subtle blue look. I would be inclined maybe here to add a bit more saturation into the shadows to make it a bit more punchy and dramatic. And then we have the green one. Again, it works quite well. Oh, looks like I do have a car photo over here, but it's nothing too special. First of all, this image is a bit underexposed. Let's apply some exposure over here. The base preset adds more punch and contrast. Maybe it went too high with exposure. Then have the blue, adds this blue tone, and the green tone. Maybe the blue tone, I would add a bit more quantity over here to make it a bit more dramatic, or maybe more saturation into the shadows, something around these lines. So guys, as you know, I'm not too fond of adding too much saturation in color grading, but I do have to recognize that maybe he does, because some of his photos are very intense in terms of the saturation. So as you can notice, these presets have some personal values that you need to adjust. The clarity is one of them. If you want to add some clarity or reduce it, then the dark point or the black point in the tone curve, if you want to fade out those blacks or not, and also the saturation in color grading. So you guys decide what works best for you guys. I'm just going to leave it a bit more conservative in all those values. So creators, I'm not too happy about the final results of this edit, but it could be down to my crappy photos and that we're applying a specific color grade into photos of a different genre. But let me know in the comment sections down below. One thing that I want you guys to take away from this video is to create a base preset with your personal look, and then you can create variants to, let's say, to apply your personal look, your consistent style into different seasons. For example, you can create a variant for winter, a variant for summer, for autumn, or for model photography or for street photography. You can basically be a bit more consistent with your color grading and achieve your own personal brand and look by creating a preset and creating variants out of it. So that's it for today, guys. Remember that these 3 presets are in the LLI preset pack V3, link up there if you want to support me. That's it for today. I think that's it for this year. I'll see you in January. I'm Tony Fuentes. Cheers to all of you, and I'll see you in the next one.